Hi, today I'm going to discuss some of the books I read this year. Every time I sit down to film this, I can't. I either lose my voice or something else happens which makes this impossible. I'm guessing that's because I fear that I cannot do them justice, because some of them were incredible and others were awful. Frustrations aside, the first novel I'm going to talk about is Froth of the Daydream, or Film of the Daze by Boris Vian. I usually enjoy books where the author doesn't focus only on the plot, but plays with the form as well. There's absolutely nothing extraordinary about the story. The author himself summarized it in a sentence, which I'm not going to read simply because I respect you too much. You're welcome. In short, there's a French guy who can only be in two states. He's either in a good mood or asleep, and he wants to fall in love. And then he falls in love. But there's more to it than meets the eye, and since you insist on talking about eyes, fine, I'm going to reveal his makeup routine. Colin put back his comb and, seizing the nail clippers, beveled the corners of his actual eyelids, adding a touch of mystery to his appearance. Don't worry, they grow back pretty quickly. Apparently, it works for him, since on his first date, even a pink cloud is on his side. It deigns to surround him on his date and make the world around them more beautiful. But not everything is rainbows and unicorns. Their first interaction was so awkward. Her name is Chloe, and there's this song, Chloe's Song of the Swamp, and Duke Ellington's recording is the most famous one. So Colin asks her, "Have you been put into arrangement by Duke Ellington?" He obviously has to run away because you cannot recover after this embarrassment, which I've never considered as an option after saying something silly. And by the way, the song and the wobbly dance from the adaptation are so catchy. Reading this book was like watching Un Chien Andalou, but more fun. The world is full of magic, and you have to take the metaphors seriously. I thought that the style of this novel wouldn't be for me. I thought that I would like the world place and let Vian horse around at first, but that after a few chapters, everything would become repetitive. And it didn't. I got sucked in from the first pages, and now, months afterwards, it still won't let me go. I loved both its cynicism and sentimentality, and the fact that it evokes such strong emotions with so much ease. The clash between reality and ideals is so heartbreaking here. Reality is so disappointing, and it brings the characters nothing but sorrow. And the author did his absolute best to portray it in the worst light possible. This was written in 1946, an appropriate time to be disappointed with everything. It's definitely anti-establishment, and it brings up issues that are still relevant today. Colin, the main character, has a friend, Chic, who is obsessed with a philosopher called Jean Sartre, who wrote a book called The Vomit, which became a huge success. And this philosopher has a partner, Duchesse de Beauvoir. Sounds familiar, right? Chic is a huge fan, but he's obsessed with emblems, and he doesn't dive deep into his idol's philosophy. Blindly following an ideology doesn't bring much happiness. And then there's also the problem of work. Vian criticizes employers and their horrible treatment of workers, and the work that reduces people to the level of machines. One of the characters makes a mistake, and the manager threatens him, then gives him the option to be transferred to a different shift. He confesses to the manager that work isn't his favorite pastime. Obviously, you can't say that, so he's immediately replaced. The narrator is also skeptical about doctors' ability to treat anything, really. The scenes with the doctor were the funniest ones. The author also plays with space. You know, when you're ill and your room gets dim and damp, or when you have less money and it starts to shrink, so much so that it becomes unrecognizable. Or your room can become round because you listened to too much jazz the other day. There were two scenes with Christ on a cross, two conversations that the protagonist had with him, both of which are not for the very serious reader who can get very seriously offended. The book is about love and the sacrifices people make, but even when tackling very serious topics, it still remains playful and beautiful. It has jazz, puns, inventions, and made-up words. The author was a man of many talents, so if you like musicians, engineers, and games, this is your guy. I think that the next book is severely underrated, and it was so amazing at times that I couldn't believe I was this close to skipping the author altogether. The book is Who's to Blame by Herzen or Gerzen. I knew two things about it. One is that it influenced the way Russian novels were written. It had an impact on people like Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Chernyshevsky, and company. And two is that it's the quintessential Russian classic, but in a bad way. The first one is a fact, and the second is an opinion I read on the internet. I don't know why I was so scared. I thought that it would be boring, that it would go on and on about the most important problems I've already read about. There's one little thing that might catch you by surprise. At first, the author feels like he has to write the biography of every character he introduces. It's funny, you almost want to reach out to him and tell him. I know that in the novels you read, the authors usually wrote a backstory for the main characters when they would play a role later on, but you don't have to do that. Don't get me wrong, the backstories are as entertaining and certainly not as long as the digressions in Don Quixote, but you still worry that they won't go anywhere. He describes this man and his life and how he married his wife and his illegitimate daughter and the tutor who came into their life, and they all seem to be okay-ish people, and they all have to overcome certain very normal challenges. While you read, you are waiting for some sort of disaster, some moral dilemma, and the author plants all the seeds very carefully. Unlike other popular writers of his time, he was a bit of an outsider, so his portrayal of nobility was different from Tolstoy or Turgenev's, for instance. The novel is quite short, but it was definitely one of my favorite reads of this year. It's about family life and the problems that come with that. It's about education, ideals, and the mistakes good people make when there's no one to blame, really. And that's the trouble. The author gets these people, and I feel like we're friends now. This wasn't his first fictional work, but I think it was his first novel. So his errors are the book's greatest strengths in a way. You can't really tell where it's going. Is it going to be about the drama in the first family, or is it going to be about the tutor, or about the superfluous man who comes out of nowhere almost? Let's be honest, it's a Russian classic, so there's a 90% chance he's coming back from Switzerland. One of the problems raised here is the split between theory and practice. In the 18th century, many French, and not just French guys, thought they'd found the way to live, and they wrote really influential books which almost gave you all the answers. But when it comes to applying those teachings, things tend to be more complicated. So this is the superfluous man's problem. He's learned so many things, yet he's unprepared for life. He doesn't know how to solve the very real and urgent problems that come his way. His intelligent and well-meaning tutor didn't give him any practical knowledge, and now he's lost. Something inspired him to return to Russia, but he soon discovers that he doesn't belong there. First, he doesn't follow the rules. He doesn't play cards. He talks to women as if they were rational people, and this is a quote, by the way. You know what? I'm going to tell you something about the author's life which might help you understand the book and his thoughts better. He and his wife were both illegitimate children. They had a lot in common. They used to write letters to each other, and their love was very idyllic. But as soon as they got married, things changed, because apparently his wife didn't have anything to focus on besides their love, while his main concerns were philosophy and politics. His mission was to fight against serfdom, and he really wanted to improve the lives of women. He thought that partners should be equals and that the wife shouldn't sacrifice herself for her husband and children, but instead focus on herself and her contribution to society. He thought that in the future there would be no marriages, that women would be liberated from their duties and wouldn't have to bear their master's name. Well, his teachings didn't work out quite the way he imagined. His wife was influenced by the literature he gave her, like George Sand's books, in a different way. The ending is tragic, and it relates to the plot of the novel to a certain extent. Anyway, now, if you decide to read Who's to Blame, you'll understand why some characters need to be punished. Some people describe this as too cruel, even for Russian literature, but most of it is quite sweet and even funny. Like, the letter episode was a perfect comedy of errors, and that episode was preceded by a gentle reminder to live in the present. This was a letter, a poem, a prayer. He wept and felt happy. While writing, he experienced a brief moment of absolute bliss. These moments, usually as evanescent as lightning flashes, are the best, most beautiful things in our lives. Yet, we don't really know how to appreciate them. Instead of reveling in them, we rush on, anxiously anticipating something more in the future. I looked up if there's a reliable English translation, and there's one by Michael Katz. I trust him because I used his translation of Crime and Punishment for the videos. I decided to read Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe because I didn't enjoy Heart of Darkness, and this book seems to be like something else entirely. I'm more interested in the perspective of the colonized rather than the colonizer. I didn't expect it to be a direct response to Conrad's novel. Why would it be? I just wanted to be something more nuanced, maybe. I don't know if it's supposed to be historically accurate or not. I'll look it up later. But even if it isn't, it should be enjoyed for its aesthetic qualities, not just facts. It's the story of this troubled man who lives in an Igbo village. He is controlled by the expectations society has of him. Since his father was a weak man, he strives towards the opposite of that. He is strong, he's brave, he's very manly, whatever that's supposed to mean. He's an important part of his community. Oh, and from the first chapter you can see that agriculture plays a big role in the novel. Yam stood for manliness. Very exciting stuff. Anyway, Okonkwo, the protagonist, along with the other characters, weren't that interesting. I found it quite difficult to immerse myself into the story because it's too eventful for my taste. There are too many, dare I say, unnecessary events in there. Certain topics were touched upon but not explored, unfortunately. It took me a little bit of time to get used to the language, but nothing too scary. There were only a few words here and there. You can see that the author took inspiration from the oral tradition. I particularly enjoyed the fable about the tortoise. It resembles the chapter in which Odysseus tells Polyphemus that his name is nobody. Well, the tortoise manipulates the birds and says that his name is all of you. Since a feast was for all of you, he ate the best food and the birds had to eat the leftovers. They find a way to punish him, but their punishment wasn't really satisfying. I mean, he didn't die. I love tortoises. I don't know why I was so bloodthirsty. I'm not saying that we are personally responsible for all the mistakes our ancestors made, but a compensation would have been nice. And some of us benefit from these mistakes, unfortunately. Things Fall Apart resembles the kind of books they force you to read in school. You know, the ones with the clear lessons, the ones that inspire teachers to ask some excellent questions such as, what was the author trying to say? It leaves very little room for interpretation, which is frustrating, to tell you the truth. I expected it to challenge my assumptions, and it didn't. Maybe if I read it when it came out, my perception would have been different. I think the novel deserves better than an anthropological reading. So if you loved it for the tragedy, for Achebe's writing, or for anything else, please share your love in the comments. For me, it was too much and not enough at the same time. Plot-wise, it was very dense. Character-wise, it was very intriguing, but it didn't go far enough when it comes to using these elements. The next book was one of those cases when I should have trusted my instincts. Don't read books that are called The War and Peace of that country or that century. They're never War and Peace. And Quiet Flows the Dawn is an epic about the Cossacks in World War I and the Civil War. But don't worry, in case you're not really interested in the revolution and the wars, then you can follow the life of the main character and his family and his women. The book is really cruel, so trigger warning for too many things to mention here. So Grigory Merekhov, our protagonist, falls in love with another man's wife, Aksenia, who has lived quite a good life up to this point. Her father raped her, then her entire family beat him to death, and then she married this man who beats her regularly, and now she fell in love with this guy for some reason. These things are described in a few pages quite early on, so they won't ruin the book for you. Guess what? Aksenia's husband goes somewhere and Aksenia and her lover do the deed and everyone knows about it. And she's like, what are we going to do when my husband comes back? And her lover acts like a true gentleman and says, what are we going to do? What are you going to do? You're his wife. I love it when people take responsibility for their actions, or maybe I just dislike this guy in particular. I also hate the fact that women who deserve so much better fall for him. So I read Dr. Zhivago a few years back, and I hated most of it, though the first 200 pages were intriguing, and the poetry was obviously good. I've heard that And Quiet Flows the Dawn had a different style, although it was written around the same period. I've heard about the hundreds of ways the author could describe sweat, and about how full of events and love and life this book was. In fact, there's too much needless cruelty that's described like something casual. I assume it's a reflection of those times, but I don't think you need all the shades of mud to paint the picture. At least the enemy is portrayed as human, and romantic love isn't this chaste thing. Also, some people question the authorship, just like they did with Margaret Mitchell and Gone with the Wind. The proponents of this theory say that nobody can write as well as Sholokhov did when they're in their 20s. To be honest, boring wouldn't be the right word to describe this epic, but exhausting would work. I've no idea why they make young people read it in school. Of course, most of them are going to read the summary. You could read the first book only, and you'll get the picture more or less. Why did Sholokhov write the next 3 books is beyond me. My biggest problem was the author's laziness. I mean, I can't say that because no lazy person would write such a mammoth that's adored by so many readers, but there were so many passages taken directly from articles that had all the cliches you hope to avoid when you read such a book. Now, on the comparison some readers make, Tolstoy would focus on a detail of someone's appearance and would mention it every time this character appears, thus making it the whole thing iconic. And the way he did it was different from Dickens, for instance. Sholokhov borrowed this trick, but forgot to take Tolstoy's talent as well, so there was just too much repetition. If you take certain parts out of context, you might find some gems, but you'd have to pass for so much dirt that the pleasure would be dubious at best. If you're into indecisiveness and victim blaming, you're gonna love it. If you still want to read it and you find a 600-page version, you should know that it's either abridged or is just the first volume, because the full version is about 1,300 pages. Maybe I didn't understand the outlook of certain characters, although I actually tried. I didn't rush through it, I didn't struggle with the dialect, surprisingly, but except for maybe 10 well-written episodes, it was unbearable, 1 dawn out of 5. Speaking of mafia and the criminal world in general, I also read A Harlot High and Low, or the 41st part of the Human Comedy by Balzac. It continues the story of Lucien de Rubempré, who was the main character in Lost Illusions. Although I wouldn't say you need to read the first 40 books of the collection, I didn't. I think you need to read at least Père Goriot and Lost Illusions because these books are connected. I feel like I didn't get most of it, and I feel like the pacing might be the problem, although it has the best interrogation scenes I've ever seen. There's a character who in Père Goriot viewed murder as a possible path to success. In this novel, he pretends to be a Spanish priest. If in the previous works we saw his potential more than his actions, here we can see him as the star of the show. Lucien, remember Lucien? He falls in love with the harlot because of course he does. And a harlot's life blends the luxury and the abyss, hence the title. There's no place for the faint-hearted here. I mentioned love, but it's definitely not the main focus here. The main focus is profit. The ending will probably surprise you. I didn't expect that to happen, so if you're under the impression that classic books can't surprise you because they contain more or less the same elements, good luck with this one. And the novel seems to be connected with Vidocq's memoir. I read it last year, I think. You see, he was an ex-convict who became basically the father of criminal investigation. Just like the memoir, this book had too much action and too little reflection for my taste, so unfortunately it didn't work for me as well as Lost Illusions, for instance. If you've read Balzac's philosophical studies, please recommend something. This man wrote so many books, and his body of work is simply intimidating. Help. The Master of Petersburg by Coetzee is one of the books I think about every day. The main character is Dostoevsky, but the premise is made up. His stepson dies, or maybe he's been killed by a group of students, and Dostoevsky comes to Petersburg in secret. As a coping mechanism, this book was great. The author was grieving the death of his own son, so no matter how much I hated certain parts of it, I can't complain too much. At times, the protagonist resembles the real Dostoevsky. His forgetfulness, the way he describes the feelings before an epileptic seizure, some of his doubts were taken directly from his works and letters. Other times, the book was so false, the ending most of all. When it comes to the portrayal of his stepson, who, by the way, outlived Dostoevsky in real life, I can't be as certain because most of the things I know about him came straight from Dostoevsky or his friends or his wife. All these people were somewhat biased against him because they've seen him as his worst, and he didn't seem like the most pleasant person to deal with. On top of that, he sold most of his stepfather's library, including some rare books, while he was away, because he didn't get enough money. I've no idea how much money he needed, but I'm sure he felt mistreated and had his reasons. What was his thinking process, though? That an avid reader who had a beautiful collection, some of which were signed, some of which you couldn't buy anywhere, and who asked him to not sell them, wouldn't notice or wouldn't care. So Dostoevsky didn't have to deal with Pavel's death in real life, but he did have to deal with the death of two of his children, and his actions were different from what we see in this novel. I wonder why Coetzee didn't use any of that. I wonder why he didn't use the note Dostoevsky wrote after his wife's death about the separation of the self from everything and how things change after death, or what he felt when his father and later his brother died and he took upon himself all the responsibilities for his brother's family and reputation, which cost him and his own family years of discomfort. After the death of his infant daughter, he himself died a little. He also changed his plan for the idiot and made it the tragedy I love. Not that it helped him, or the way he coped with the death of his own son. Why not use any of that in your novel? Granted, his relationship with his stepson was different, but still, I think The Master of Petersburg failed to convey the fact that Dostoevsky was larger than his characters. Still, I smiled when he introduces himself as Isaev, the boy's father. It was both to protect himself and to come closer to the dead young man he had to provide for, educate, and most of all protect. I couldn't help thinking of how I would have treated this thing and that thing, and the misrepresentations were harder to ignore as the book progressed. Just to be clear, I wasn't mad at him for mixing up Apollon Grigoriev and Apollon Maikov, or for fabricating the premise, or for including really obvious references to Dostoevsky's works that even someone who's never read him would get. I didn't care about that, really. The first half was solid, but As soon as I understood where this was going, I was so disappointed. If Demons is your favorite novel, then I guess you'll enjoy The Master of Petersburg more than I did, but even then, it will remain derivative. Even so, I love the atmosphere, I adore the main character, some parts were so real, but all the missed opportunities were killing me. Was it worth the read? Yes, because of all the paragraphs about connection and losing a loved one, and two scenes that actually made me chuckle. One of them involved Nechayev dressed as a woman, complaining about how horribly women were treated in the streets of St. Petersburg. The novel could have been so much richer. It shouldn't have tried to be a hybrid of Dostoevsky's novels. The idea of this threshold situation, so characteristic of his works, was great. But apart from a few details, the development was inadequate. Reading A Life by Maupassant felt like reading a very good novella. No word was out of place, no heartstring left untouched. It's something that I wanted to read for a while, and it's a 10 out of 10. I don't think I've mentioned it before, but Maupassant is one of the authors I actually trust, although I read only 3 of his works. I read Bellamy in Paris, so obviously my impression of the novel was enhanced by the city itself. It was a profound study of an otherwise empty subject. A glass simply hypnotized me. I couldn't find my way home after reading it, literally. Like, I had to look it up on maps, and even then, I had trouble navigating the streets that were known to me. And now I finally read A Life, his debut novel, the one promoted by Turgenev himself to his Russian readers, the one that came second in Tolstoy's top 2 French novels. The first one was Les Miserables. It's a series of disappointments in the life of a woman. It's like watching a ship sink. It could have been called Great Expectations or Lost Illusions, but A Life is the most fitting title, most of all because it's so commonplace, but also because of Eve. You expect the masks to fall off, and this is exactly what happens. Yet, when it does, you can't say I told you, because there are some lessons that everyone has to experience for themselves. You know, your parents are people too, priests are people, people aren't always the way they pretend to be, gratitude isn't something you should expect, you are ultimately alone, lessons like that. If you liked certain aspects of Madame Bovary but disliked others, like me, you will probably enjoy A Life more. There's a young and beautiful woman who grew up in a beautiful place, surrounded by nature, close to the sea, who was raised by nuns and isolated from life. If in Madame Bovary you feel for Charles, the husband, here most readers will have no kindness for Jean's husband, who views marriage as just a transaction. You'll see through him right away, and you won't get why Jean's parents allowed this transaction to happen. Granted, their daughter is young and naive, but they should have known better. While I was reading about their honeymoon, I couldn't believe that Maupassant wasn't a girl, just like with Dostoevsky and Netochka Nezvanova. Her mother doesn't know how to explain her wifely duties, so she sends her father. And he's even more confused and just says, obey your husband. She doesn't get it. Education and control play a big role in this novel, especially the mistakes you can make as a parent. If you're looking for characters who will inspire you, look elsewhere. Everyone in this book is amusing at best and sadistic at worst. Most of them are normal people. You will definitely recognize the patterns you see here. You can notice the roles people play and the way they try to make life more bearable. For instance, the Baroness, Jean's mother, always speaks of her hypertrophy as if it belonged to her and her alone. Or Jean's husband drinks regularly, spends her parents' money as he wishes, and neglects his personal appearance with the carelessness of a man who no longer strives to fascinate. Jean, the main character, doesn't have any interests, any passions, so after the wedding and the honeymoon, she's just waiting for something to happen to her and then to die. Although she seems to like suffering, since she's quite good at it, it's like her entire existence is spent in prison. There's nothing to do. Anything would be better than realizing that you have absolutely nothing to look forward to, today, tomorrow, or ever. If you go with the flow, you might as well flow into Acheron. Don't wait for someone to save you or for life to fix itself. Otherwise, you'll mistake the premiere for another rehearsal. If you don't do anything, you'll be under the impression that life is happening to you. And every year, it will become more and more difficult to take matters into your own hands. You will predict most of the things that are going to happen in this book. You will expect every treason. You've seen it hundreds of times. But you'll still be mad at certain characters and at yourself for expecting something different. I feel like this is a book for people who like Vivaldi, so for most people. It's authentic, and it manages to capture the cycle of life just as well. The next book was yet another attempt to read a dystopian novel, and this time I went straight to the dystopian novel, We, by Yevgeny Zamyatin. Just so you know, it was written before 1984, but you will find many similarities. In the one state, everyone wears the same clothes, they don't have real names, they live in glass houses, follow the same routine, and elect the benefactor unanimously. If they fail to understand that we bring them mathematically infallible happiness, it will be our duty to compel them to be happy. But before resorting to arms, we shall try the power of words. They just wanted to make life easier, to reduce the pain, reduce the suffering, which makes sense. It reminded me of the Grand Inquisitor because, of course, it did, who is sure he knows what's better for others. Freedom is the primitive condition, according to us. The main character, D503, is an engineer who works on the Indigo, a spaceship, and he starts writing in his journal, and we see everything from his perspective. It was a bit boring, in part due to the language. As I understand, both the narrator and the writer were analytical people. It's a manuscript without personality, but this was the intention, so I'm not sure what I expected. At times you can see the irony, the paradoxes left there by the author, who was a naval engineer, so no stranger to math. Though, for me personally, none of them were as efficient as Notes from Underground, written by another engineer. But that's just a question of taste. Thinking that there can be no other revolution because your revolution was the last one is laughable, but there were too many laughable ideas to be mentioned here. What would you choose? Happiness without freedom or freedom without happiness? I guess many people have neither, so any option would be an improvement. This particular state isn't aesthetically pleasing, but hey, at least your basic needs are covered. True algebraic love of humanity is inevitably inhuman, and the inevitable mark of truth is its cruelty. In this place, people don't have to worry about their future or about love, which otherwise would take so much space in their mind. Love is reduced to pink tickets so that people would become more efficient. It would be unfair to reduce the novel to being a satire on the Soviet Union. I think it was more like a warning of what our civilization might turn into if we become less and less human, and a warning against totalitarian regimes in general, even the ones that resemble a perfect mechanical world. The next book is what I would describe as the complete opposite of rational. It's The Vampire by Count Aleksey Tolstoy. Yes, a relative. There's a ball, and a strange man tells, let's say, the main character that there are vampires in this room. That he himself went to the funerals of some of them. You might wonder, what's the distinctive feature? All vampires need to have a thing, right? Well, in the case of this novella, they click their tongues when they meet. At the same ball, he also meets an elderly woman and her granddaughter, Dasha, and he'll later go to visit them and see the portrait of her relative. Her relative's fiancé disappeared right before their wedding, and she died, but on her deathbed, she said some strange words which will play an important role later in the story. Did I mention that she looks exactly like Dasha? It's a gothic tale, so of course she does. There's also the story of an Italian and his haunted villa, which is called The Devil's House for a reason, and the things some characters get to experience there. The narrative is quite complex for a novella. It's like a story within a story within a story, and although at times you don't get what one part has to do with another, most of it makes sense by the end. Some things are presented as legends, dreams, hallucinations, or rumors, so you never know who you can trust. The transitional state is what makes everything more exciting. I really enjoyed it because I didn't know what to expect. You see, because there's a Leo in the Tolstoy clan, no other writer with this last name can get as much recognition as the Lion King, not outside Russia. I'm really interested to find out what else his rich imagination had to offer. I started Victober on the wrong foot. I read Dracula by Bram Stoker, thinking that it would continue the whole vampire theme I started with Tolstoy's novella. I also happened to like the adaptation, against all odds, mostly thanks to certain actors, the costumes, and the decorations apparently. I knew that my perception of the book itself would be different, in part because, as a 21st century person, I know all the answers. Why would a character be anemic in a vampire novel? Who is the Count? But here's how some of Stoker's contemporaries perceive it. Mr. Bram Stoker should have labeled his book for strong men only. It is for the man with a sound conscience and digestion who can turn out the gas and go to bed without having to look over his shoulder more than half a dozen times as he goes upstairs. No, if you read the novel, you know how untrue this is. The narrative style doesn't help at all. There were a few interesting bits that I didn't expect, but for the most part, the visual storytelling of the adaptation works better than the letters. Yes, it's an epistolary novel, and most characters who get to write are too annoying or too Victorian or too concerned with their own little problems. The whole thing is drawn out. Mina and Lucy are two friends who are about to get married. There are complete opposites, which will play a role later in the story. Mina is going to marry Jonathan, who goes on a business trip to Dracula's castle. When a new aspect of the story is being introduced, that's exciting. But when you feel like this is the fifth letter with the same idea, it loses its charm. Reading Dracula was bearable, but only thanks to the small details rather than the broad strokes. The character's concern with documenting everything got old very quickly, and the fact that the narrators don't explore the most thrilling aspects you'd expect to find in this novel. The scenes in the Count's castle reminded me of Bluebeard. Dracula is just as feared and mysterious, and also has dead wives, which could also be a parallel to Lucy's freak grooms. When the vampires want to pierce Jonathan, Dracula exclaims, "This man belongs to me." And at some point, Jonathan is looking for a key. Is he about to become his new wife? Just like Bluebeard, the novel warns us against the risks of exploring the unknown, of the temptations that await us. You should fear your own desires. Fear the East attacking the West. No wonder Lucy's last name is Westerner. You should fear your shadow. And most of all, you should fear becoming a parasite with a constant thirst and no way of satisfying it, with the desire to create followers but no way of reproducing other than through someone's death and eternal suffering. I can understand many readers' frustrations with this book, but I can also relate to their desire to find something more profound than the things it offers on the surface. The other book I read in October was Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope. It's the second volume of the Chronicles of Barchester. For some people, it's their favorite novel by Trollope, but I hated it. If you're not into novels about the church and politics, this won't be for you, as it wasn't for me. After all, the church is the most important institution in this town, so most of the plot revolves around that. The old bishop dies, and he's replaced by a new one who isn't the best. It's about the war between high church and low church and the small town drama. The main theme is the struggle for power. The fight becomes more and more ridiculous as the novel progresses, But unfortunately, it didn't do anything for me. Mr. Slope starts to court a woman not because he fell in love, God forbid, don't worry, but because he wanted a wife and he wanted money, but he wanted power more than either. The narrator is really open from the beginning, and he comes up with the most efficient way to turn readers against a character. I never could endure to shake hands with Mr. Slope. A cold, clammy perspiration always exudes from him. The only thing I liked about this novel was Trollope's attitude towards the readers. He acts as if we were on the same team. At some point he says, you and I and her other friends. Or he can play the sincerity card by telling us, if she did this, he would have done that, and everything would be changed. But then he, Trollope, couldn't have written the novel. The characters are interesting in theory, but in practice, not really. There's a lioness whose charm conquers all the men. Then there's a woman who controls her husband and tries to take control of the whole town. Then there are the ambitious clergymen and so on. Anyway, it felt longer than it was, and I'm not as excited about reading Trollope as I used to be. Reading a few works by Daniil Kharms can improve your social skills significantly. It didn't help me, as you can see, but it wasn't my goal really. Building and developing an idea in 5 or 6 sentences is one thing. Making it funny, original, and spot on is a whole nother story. Oh wait, it's the same one in his case. I read a description of him a few years ago, and it was hands down the most awesome description ever. A genius of delirium, an absurd man, a self-created character, a counterculture hero, and so on. The collection I read included most of his stories and sketches. 90% of them were about the same length as a sentence in Tolstoy or Dostoevsky's case, so it's perfect for people who spend more time on TikTok. This is not an attack. He can use his magnifying glass on any everyday object, and he'll make it both absurd and relatable. Or he can explore something that's more out there, that isn't an everyday thing, but rather more like a once or twice a year thing. Like in his most famous short story, The Old Woman, a character is stuck with an old woman who happens to be dead. Some fans have called this Alona Ivanovna Revenge of the Alona, like a spin-off to Crime and Punishment. His prose has better rhythm and more punchlines that some musicians and comedians can't even dream of. And he's so smooth too. I don't know many writers who could get away with writing so much nonsense. There's a sketch about a French man. Someone gave him a sofa, a table, 2 chairs, and an armchair. He lies on the sofa and thinks that the chair would be better. He sits on the chairs, and then he gets tired of all this traveling. He wants to lie on the sofa, but the armchair seems more comfy. He feels like a king sitting in the armchair, but it's too lush. Perhaps the sofa would be better. Why do a few moments of indecisiveness tell us so much about people? So many choices to make, so many opportunities to choose the wrong thing, and that's just in your room. Imagine what happens outside. If you like Gogol's funnier side, then you should know that he was his favorite writer. But Harms's approach is more minimalistic, I think. He experiments a lot. He makes fun of success stories, of stories that don't go anywhere, about people just meeting other people on the street, or about a typical day in the tram, or it can be a more delicate problem. Like, what do you do with a cashier who isn't a cashier, but a woman who was hired to turn a cash register handle because she seemed a bit rude when she suddenly dies? What do you do then? All his works are like parodies of reality, and they play with your expectations from stories. What makes an event? Does it need characters? Do all the elements have to be relevant? Or can you add something meaningless to them? Harms never overstays his welcome, and he always leaves the readers wanting more, but always with the realization that their desires are their problems. Even when he writes variations of the same sentence over and over, everything goes by so fast. Everything is so fleeting, and most events are non-events. I loved it. I'm going to film the next video soon enough, but that's it for today. Thanks for watching. Bye!